Recently, I realized that the founder of this website called the Humans of Tehran was actually interviewed by Dawn magazine in Rawalpindi as he was passing through. And he said that the Pakistanis fly over Iran to go to Turkey, and the Iranians fly over Pakistan to go to Delhi and to Bangkok, and these people absolutely don't know each other. And so there's definitely a need to have a lot more exchanges to actually know each other. But if you did stop over Iran today, you'd see a lot of paradoxes. And I think that Iran has become a land of paradoxes. We get these images of the black chador and lots of people wearing head-to-toe black chadors. But then when you go to Iran, there is this second world on Instagram where Botox women with their lips and then the nose and then the made-up blonde hair are dancing almost nude, and basically as if the kind of freedoms that they have on Instagram, which they don't have at all in the streets. President Trump has made Iran as one of the biggest enemies. But when you, actually, I was in Iran last month and I found the amount of Iranian taxi drivers' support for Trump the highest I'd ever seen anywhere else. And they were telling, I mean, of course, Iranian taxi drivers, they always tell you what you want to hear, but I think that they were basically saying, this man, as opposed to our governors who are not men, but this man doesn't like our regime and is going to change it, and he actually stands by his word. So this kind of paradox of this love-hatred that there is with the US. The social classes, we had a revolution in order to equalize the social classes, but today the children of the people who made the revolution are all studying abroad, the people who are actually took over the houses of the former government people or aristocrats are actually themselves now becoming the rich classes. So the social classes is still also the continuation of these big gaps is the other paradox of the revolution. And I would say also, of course, the sanctions, you hear about the economic problems of people, the crippling sanctions, but if you go to restaurants in Tehran, they're full till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the stores are full of commodities, Western made. So there's this absolute paradox that is to be understood. What is this Iran of today? We are going to be talking culture, identity, youth, the art scene with the 4 panelists. Let me introduce them one more time for you here. Ms. Kami Mohammadi, Miss here, author, journalist, broadcaster. By the way, the 4 of us are Iranians based in Europe, although we all have, I think, a big love of Iran, but she lives in Italy. She's the author of the Cyprus book, Cyprus Tree, that was published in 2011, which is a family memoir about Iran, the revolution, exile, and return. She has another book that's going to be launched tomorrow here, Bella Figura, which is about how to eat and love the Italian way. So this good difference from the first book to the second. Her journalistic work has been awarded for human rights journalism and a number of other awards. She's written in Financial Times, Sunday Times, Google her, she has excellent credentials to be. And what's very also interesting, she's co-authored the Lonely Planet Guide to Iraq. Mr. Vali Mahrouji here, Mahrouji, on my left here, is a London-based curator, founder of archaeology of the final decade, which I hope he will be explaining more to us. He's an advisor to the British Museum, exhibits on modern Iran, contemporary Iran. He's the director of the Kaveh Golestan estate. His work has been showed, curated work has been showed at the Foam Photograph Museum in Amsterdam, at the Musée d'Art Moderne de Ville de Paris, and many other places. And the Tate Modern has dedicated a room in its permanent collection, recreating some of the work from his work, recreating the Citadel and Mr. Golestan's series on prostitutes. To the left here, Mr. Afshin Shahi, I think you met him yesterday, those of you who heard him, he's a political commentator, senior lecturer, international relations, Middle Eastern studies, the Institute, Development and Peace Studies Department at Bradford. He's author of the book on the politics of truth among truth management in Saudi Arabia that came out in 2013, and a forthcoming book on Iran, the Shia state and the Sunni minority, which should be a very interesting book. Myself, I'm a professor in Sciences Po in Paris. I'm a specialist of human security and extremism. I work mostly on Central Asia, Afghanistan. I'll be talking tomorrow. So, to begin this talk, I wanted first to pay homage to one of yours who also loved our country, even though he never went there. He never went to Iran. He spoke Urdu at home, but wrote 9,000 out of his 15,000 couplets in my Persian language. He wrote about to the West, rising to the Europeans, finding themselves and finding pride in their culture, in their ancestors, and in order to be able to unite in an Islamic ummah. Of course, I'm talking about your Iqbal Lahore. And if you permit me, I would like to actually read his poem in Farsi. And I think those of you who know this poem very well might hear the intonation a little bit differently from the way that you would be pronouncing. I think that would be, you all know this poem, you might be reciting it with me. So, forgive me also for my pronunciation. So, ای غنچه خوابیده چو نرگس نگران خیز کاشانه ما رفت به تاراج غمان خیز از ناله مرغ چمن از بانگ اذان خیز از گرمی هنگامه آتش نفسان خیز از خواب گران خواب گران خواب گران خیز از خواب گران خیز خاور همه مانند غبار سر راهی است یک ناله خاموش و سر باخته آهی است هر ذره این خاک گره خورده نگاهی است از هند و سمرقند و عراق و همدان خیز از خواب گران خیز از خواب گران خواب گران خواب گران خیز فریاد از افرنگ و دلاویزی افرنگ فریاد ز شیرین و پرویزی افرنگ عالم همه ویرانه ز چنگیزی افرنگ معمار حرم باز به تعمیر جهان خیز از خواب گران خواب گران خواب گران خیز. You know this poem. He is calling on the Eastern people to wake up from their slumber, from their sleep, from their costly sleep, and get rid of the Europeans or rebuild the world according to their ethics and ethos. Now, he basically created a dichotomous world of the Urupa, Europe, and the Sharq, the East, which for him was the Muslim people. Interestingly enough, about this identity, and I wanted to first start with this question about the identity, he basically never went to Iran, as I said, but he has a poem written for the Iranian youth where he is telling them that I can see from your walls that a person will come and will basically liberate you. In Iran, when the Iranian Revolution was an answer to what Iqbal wanted, so when the Iranian Revolution happened 40 years last month, or beginning of this month, the slogan was, Na Sharqi, na Gharbi, Jumhuriye Islami. So the Iranian Revolution the Iranian identity did not want to necessarily place itself in the Sharq that Lahore wanted. But it's no East, no West, but the Islamic Republic. And that comes from also a kind of triple identity that Iran always had. The Westoxification, as one of our writers talked about, Alhamra, that talked about the fact that the Iranians are very much Gharb Zadegi, very Westoxified. Of course, the Iranian national identity that was even able to change Islam, and the Islamic identity. So basically, my first question to our panelists is 40 years after the revolution, where are we with these identities? Are we Persian? Are we Muslim? Are we Sharq? Are we still Westoxified? So, Kamija, would you like to answer that? We'll start with that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really fascinating question, and I think it's something that has certainly, for the Iranian character and sense of being in the world, it's something that has resonated for more than a century, and and perhaps will continue, because we've had this interesting love-hate relationship with the West from the 18-something onwards, right? And in terms of our own identity, I think it's very difficult for us not to identify ourselves in some relationship to the West and to the gaze of the West. So the Orientalism, or whether we're self-orientalizing, or whether we're pushing that away, or whether we're embracing it. And you yourself know that a big irony of Iran today is that it's, in a way, much more West-oxified than it was under the Shah. So if that was the project of the Iranian Revolution, from that point of view, it hasn't necessarily succeeded. So what are we? I don't know. It would be lovely to be in a world, I think, and I say this from a broader point of view than just my heritage, which of course has haunted me all my life. I left Iran at the age of 9. I went to the UK, which was then relatively multicultural, but is very much more now. But of course, as you will have, I'm sure, experienced also going to France, it was a very different world, and we had to do all sorts of things to fit in, I think, and to be accepted. So, I always enjoy traveling back to this part of the world, because it's lovely, first of all, to be somewhere where to be called Mohammadi is not a problem, and also in a world where, the Persian legacy is so strong and known about, because I think that, those of us who have grown up or live in the West, we carry almost a burden that we're always trying to kind of establish, to the Western world. Look, we're not just those kind of the images that you saw in your TVs in 79. The revolution was the first televised revolution, right? So it gave a very strong image of Iran to the world. And I still read, coming out of the younger generation, articles and just even things that people post on Facebook. We're constantly kind of going, look at our glorious past. Look how much civilization we have. Look how much we've given the world. We have this kind of terrible inferiority kind of complex, I think. And within our own culture, I think we have a real face-off between the inferiority and also the sort of superiority that we feel at the same time. It's one of the very many paradoxes that makes being Iranian so rich and interesting on all sorts of levels. So going beyond that question, it'd be lovely to be in a world where we weren't bound by all of those definitions, right? Maybe that's really idealistic, so let me hand it over.
I was just asked a question about what I think about Iranian identity. It may be a very important and, as you said, fascinating question, but believe me, this is one of the most difficult questions that probably I was asked over the last few weeks to respond to. Because the moment that you try to break down the very notion of identity, let alone to the notion of Iranianness, you are confronted with a lot of difficulties and a lot of complexities. What is identity and what is political identity? Because very often when we're talking about a national identity, we are referring to a political project. Iranian national identity, Pakistani national identity, any other national identities, they're not separated from kind of a systematic top-down process of nation building, which is inherently and quintessentially political. As the famous state builder, Mazzini, the father of one of the fathers of Italian Risorgimento said, he said, we have created Italy, now let's create Italians. What he meant by that statement is that actually nation building and national identity very much is the product of political and social construction. And of course, that makes responding to this kind of question extremely difficult. Because if the national identity is a political project, this political project often responds to emerging or prevailing socio-political dynamics. In terms of kind of ethnic and social and cultural identity, maybe some of you know that Iran is a very kind of multifaceted and multidimensional country. You cited this very beautiful poem in Persian by Iqbal Lahori, and vast majority of people in the world recognize Iran as a Persian country. But Iran is not a Persian country. Only about 50% of the population speak Persian as the first language. Almost half of the people in Iran don't speak Persian or Farsi as the first language. This in itself makes this country very, very interesting. And of course, like most nation-building kind of projects in the 20th century, the central government comes with a mission to create a nation. And unfortunately, in the Middle East and most of the developing world, the model that the political elite adopted to create the nation was extremely exclusive and at times chauvinistic and supremacist. And that's why actually you recognize Iran as a Persian country, because the nation-building model which was adopted was extremely Persian-centric and state-centric, despite the fact that over 50% of the population do not even speak Persian. So this makes kind of the question very complicated, because over the last 100 years, when the idea of modern nation-building started, there has been a lot of difficulties to merge ethnic, religious, cultural, linguistic identities with this political project that today we call Iran. Because we have a limited time, I just want to kind of keep this kind of very brief. I kind of started my first response with provoking a question, or at least complicated things a little bit further, and I let my colleague to kind of carry on, and then I'll continue later on.
I just want to say that the project to put all of these different ethnic groups into this political project of Iran, and to also keep alive this idea of the revolution, which was an Islamic revolution, creates these kinds of,
I'll get into the revolution later on if I have an opportunity.
Okay.
But I thought it is actually a very good idea, because probably vast majority of people maybe have not been to Iran or have not studied enough about Iran. Maybe I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong. And this is a very interesting kind of a starting point. If we are decoding Iran, we better start with kind of some very essential and fundamental question about what constitutes the national identity.
Yeah, and the mosaic of language, ethnicity, and religion. Well, what's your identity and what's Iranian identity?
Hello, everyone. Well, I work as an art curator, and I've focused the last 10 years of my life essentially looking at subaltern histories and looking at areas of disappearances, sites of disappearances, where material has been removed, erased, banned, or destroyed. And in my kind of area of study, I think that it's essential for us, and is also the right of any nation, to have contact with the totality of its culture and totality of its history. And those areas that have been removed and have been erased are actually seminal to the understanding of if there is such a thing as identity, which I think is a very complicated issue, especially in a case like Iran. And I'm not really interested in kind of reducing it to anything like an identity in any case. I think if we're going to understand the experience of being an Iranian, that's for me more interesting than an identity of being an Iranian, then we must understand the totality of what we've been going through, and we have to reincorporate and recirculate the knowledge and the memory that's been removed, and also reconcile ourselves with the experiences, a lot of which have been traumatic over the last 40 years, to the extent that we have not experienced it in our modern history, the extent of it. Now, I first thought I'll start anecdotally. I asked a friend of mine who's a writer, a French writer, who just came back from Tehran 2 weeks ago. He was invited there for a theater festival for his writing, for his performance, to give me his recollections of Iran. So I'm talking on the grassroots, on the sort of personal level. So I'm going to read it to you. So this is Jean-René Lemoine, who's Haitian French playwright. Here I am back from Tehran, where I was invited to present a reading of one of my plays at the festival. It was the first time that I went to Iran. On the one hand, I was fascinated by the elegance of the people, their smile, their sense of hospitality, and all the sweetness that emanated from them. And on the other hand, I always felt the leaden weight bearing on this society, the lack of freedom that becomes screamingly obvious in a detail, in a word that sometimes escapes. I had the feeling that Iranians, at least the ones I met, have found a compromise with the tragedy of their experience and their existence. The feeling also that there is in them a particular modesty which inclines them not to reveal themselves, to cultivate even a carelessness, a joy which is undoubtedly real during the moment of the conversation and of the exchange, but which finally rests on an immense abyss. I felt welcomed, pampered. Was it a rapport of passing, ephemeral seduction, a superficial sociality? I do not think so. There was really a generosity, a humanity towards the other. But what I feel is the individual's loneliness that the authoritarian regime has created. I also feel how much it has amputated this people of its true identity, of its history. It's incredible to think that in 4 decades, we can erase or try to erase centuries of history of an extraordinary culture. But there was a trace of the past here that remains against all odds, unlike China, when the incest between communism and capitalism seems to have erased every culture and every memory. There is here a palpable resistance, but it is as if that resistance cannot find its structure. This creates a permanent ambiguity, a conflict between a kind of resigned indolence and the suffering of the being in revolt. These are, of course, only my first impressions of a country that has left a deep impression on me and where, strangely enough, miraculously, immediately I felt at home. And that was written 2 days ago. So I think for me, it was interesting to get a writer who's extremely sensitive as a person to convey his impressions of Iran, which tap into my own struggle as an art curator who is looking at areas of art and culture that allow me to provoke moments in history and evoke a sense of social responsibility and a sort of awareness, political awareness, to kind of activate memory in ways that may have something to do with this vague thing called identity. But it's not so much identity, but it is what we experience. And in that, I have been focusing on areas of trauma, which is what he's talking about, that leaden weight that we bear. And I want to just say one thing, that the resilience and the brilliance of Iranian culture, its creativity, its thinking, its joie de vivre, its loveliness, its smile, is not to be taken for granted. That there is a huge and immense and unnecessary amount of trauma inflicted on that same people and on all of us, even in the diaspora, which have to survive in spite of each other, in a way. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you. And this kind of generosity, positiveness, politeness, and the trauma creates this kind of complex personality, which I think that is part of our DNA and also comes. So shall we take the discussion to the question of like what does it leave the youth today? Iran is a very young country. There's quite a lot of people with aspirations, frustrations, but there's a high level of unemployment. But they actually do have resilience, they do have hope. You see a very, very interesting pieces of, well, resistance or actually expression that's coming out through different types of artistic modalities in Iran, lots of creativity that portrays these kinds of paradox of pain and joie de vivre. So what kinds of flickers of this do you see in the youth?
When I go back to Iran, of course, I always think that the hope of the country is with the youth because they seem so engaged and so alive. And so sometimes, you go back to Europe and feel like everyone's half asleep compared to the massively kind of stimulated and engaged way that people are in Iran. And also the fact that they've always had to read between the lines and navigate, very difficult sort of red lines and barriers. So they're very fluid and flexible. And the population is hugely young, as you said. The majority, what is it, 60 or 70%, I'm sure my panelists know, are under the age of 40, so they were born after the revolution. So, this is a population that anyway has access to the rest of the world because there is, also long before the internet, there was, satellite television that's meant to be illegal, but everyone has it, beamed in from all over the world, the diaspora making programs in places like LA, all over. Of course, I think that, I don't know the case now, but when the internet and blogging was in its infancy, I think Farsi was the second most blogged language in the world, right? So the cyberspace has given these people, and these young people particularly, a space in which they can reveal themselves. That space is not always available in a physical form. But certainly now with social media and the fact that, we've got the best sort of code breakers in the world, and, there's always a way around the restrictions that the regime kind of puts. I don't know if that's perceived outside of the country, but, you feel that very strongly when you're there. You'll have written on the back of bus seats, codes for breaking certain kind of filters that are put on the internet. So this space exists, and it means that people are able to express themselves. They have a kind of an interaction with the rest of the world, so there isn't a kind of closing off at all. So I find the younger generation very much part of the world and very creative in the way that they negotiate self-expression and what they want. Now, that's not to say that they aren't repressed, that life isn't hard, that all of that is there and has an effect physically, psychologically. In a way, my worry is more about the mental health of our country, because I think this fact that you have to lead, at the very least, a double life in Iran. But, you might be wearing 3 or 4 different masks at various points during the day, depending on who you're with, who you're revealing yourself to. And that's not just because of this regime. This is something that has existed in our culture for a really long time. And that's the other thing I want to say. Some of our forms of resistance, some of the ways in which, let's say, Iranian film became very famous in these last 20 or 30 years because of the way that our great directors would take very small stories, usually, often about children at the beginning, and use those very indirect storytelling methods to tell much greater truths. I see a lot of hope with the young people. I see them innovating. I think that Tehran is becoming one of the tech capitals of the world, isn't it? And that, that dynamism, I think, is very, very inspiring. There is a flip side to that, which is that the difficulty in holding that amount of tension within yourself and within your psyche can be very disruptive, I think, to one's own kind of personality.
And for a government to try to keep people with so many aspirations and to have to create jobs, otherwise the frustration, the exile, the desire to leave,
And there's just to mention that things like, you know, Iran has the highest rates of literacy in this part of the world. You know, we're over 90% literate. There's something that didn't happen so much before the revolution, which is so many people now have access to further education, to university. You know, women make up 60% of university entrance. All of these statistics. You know, Iran is much more educated actually now than it was, and it has access to all of these things. So,
I'm sure, Afshin, you will be, forgive me, but you will be giving us the statistics on high unemployment that goes the flip side of this high education, which exactly creates that kind of frustration.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't need further articulation that currently the country is facing a lot of economic difficulties. But I personally don't want to use or abuse this platform to give you facts and ideas that are already available in daily newspapers about kind of the current political and economic situation in Iran. Since, you know, the core question in this discussion is about identity, and I suppose Iranianness, decoding Iran, I want to use this kind of limited opportunity to kind of shed light on another very, very interesting dynamic which has a profound influence on the ways in which our experiences as Iranians are determined. From kind of mid-20th century until now, we have experienced two very different political regimes, but at the same time, they had a lot of commonalities. Both of them, in addition to incredible thirst for monopolization of power, they also had a cultural agenda, a cultural mission to transform Iran, to create this utopia, which called kind of New Iran. In the previous regime, the idea of Iran Novin, or the New Iran, was basically based on regenerating certain historical narratives which could kind of highlight the Persian greatness, the golden age of Persia, basically recreating or regenerating this kind of proud Persian-centric sense of kind of national consciousness. There was another kind of social and cultural mission, and that was to kind of westernize kind of Iranian socio-political structures as much as possible. If you look at kind of the early days of our exposure or experience with modernity, it was all about opening our arms 100% to the West. Just imitate everything that the West has done in order to replicate the successes and the achievements the West had. But following the revolution, despite the fact that the nature of the authoritarian system in Iran changed, but they had also a similar mission. Social engineering, very much like the Pahlavi state, was part and parcel of the Islamic Republic. Unlike the Pahlavi dynasty, which wanted to kind of take us back to the golden age of Persia and wanted to kind of secularize the country in every sense of the term, or westernize the economic structures, at least maybe not in the political sense of the term, the Islamic Republic wanted to create Medina Fadila in the 20th century. So just very briefly, both of these regimes and both of these kind of social engineering policies, to a very large extent, kind of failed, and people responded to those kind of social engineering policies, and those responses are very interesting to pay attention to, and to a very large extent kind of shape and determine the kind of experiences that you mentioned early on.
Sorry, thank you. Yes.
I'm so glad to be able to disagree.
Good.
For one thing, you set up a binary between us and the West, which I don't buy for 1 second.
I didn't
Because
actually establish the binary here.
Well, essentially
I was replicating
the
the political discourse which was represented at the time
Yeah.
of the Pahlavi
But I think the Iranians of the time of Mashruteh, who were witnessing and aware of what was going on in the world, were not merely replicating. I think they were emancipated people who were able and open enough to accept and absorb the emancipating ideas. And that's happened many places in the world and not just in our country. So on the one hand, I want to really salute, actually, the constitutional revolution of Iran that opened its arms through its own Iranian men to accept the age of reason, to accept the higher notions of enlightenment, to bring the penal code to Iran, which is incidentally what Khomeini ripped up. The regime of Khomeini ripped up the penal code in Iran. So on the other hand, my other argument with you would be that not only I wouldn't want to set up that kind of easy binary, I also wouldn't want to kind of collate what happened pre and post-revolution either in the same way that they had projects that failed the people. It's not quite as easy as that for me. Because in my experience of looking at the traumatic histories of Iran and the subaltern histories of Iran, and for example, there's a project on right now in Lahore at the Rotas 2 Gallery run by the wonderful Salima Hashmi, in which I've excavated the violence inflicted on the red light district of Tehran. Now, by Khomeini ripping up the penal code in Iran, he severed Iran's relationship with the notion of no punishment without a law, i.e., we're not equal citizens in the face of a law, but we are mortals in the face of a divine as interpreted by a mullah. And that has resulted in a situation where, I'm not going to give you exact figures, but in the 20th century in Iran, about 1,000 people lost their lives for those kind of purposes, political and semi-political stuff. And since the revolution in Iran, 40 to 60,000 people have lost their lives, officially, depending on which channel you go to. And by Amnesty International records today, Iran holds the highest number of executions per capita anywhere in the world. Now, this stuff is not to be taken lightly. This trauma is on the shoulder of every Iranian individual, is on the shoulder of society at large, and the fact that Khomeinism in Iran created something we never had before in our modern history, the conformists and the non-conformists, those who are the pious and therefore above the law, and those who are not and who are below the law, which caused situations within families that mothers handed over their children to be executed. So the level of trauma, I think, in our country is much more interesting for me, at least, to understand what we as an identity, if there is such a thing, experience and feel in a real sense, in a daily sense, in an everyday sense, and how we have to negotiate the violence that is inflicted on us and not deflected into other areas of abstraction.
May I ask you a question? Sorry, because it seems like
May I have the right of reply?
Please cut it short. No lectures, if you don't mind.
Actually, initially, I got very excited when I heard that my dear colleague disagrees with me, but then I realized that actually, in the end, your responses did not really accommodate what I really offered early on. First of all, I did not dichotomize modernity and tradition. What I said was merely a kind of the reflection of the official discourses. The official discourses of two political regimes, which in addition to a kind of monopolizing power, they also had a kind of cultural agenda to transform the socio-political particularities of Iran in relation to the prevailing political discourse of the time. But I agree with you that, of course, kind of the relationship between modernity and tradition, not only Iran, but in the rest of the Muslim world, is a lot more complicated and a lot more complex to simply divide it between black and white, because sometimes they have been competing, and at the same time, sometimes they have been merging.
In a situation where there is this trauma, there is these types of pressures, should art be only political? Can art be just aesthetic? or every artist needs to be political? This is the big question that we've had also even before the revolution, the debate between Shamlu and Sepehri. Sepehri, our poet, who was talking about do not dirty the waters downstream, and Shamlu telling him that when there are political prisoners, how can you write poetry about beauty of landscape? So in this type of environment, can art be non-political? I don't know whether you have 1 second answers on these ones, or before I open it up, or perhaps you. Can art be
No, I certainly think an artist is not held responsible to speak for the whole of society whatsoever, at all. No. But what I've ended up doing is that it didn't turn out to be like that. I found photographs which are being shown at Salima Hashmi's Rotas Gallery, which were by Kaveh Golestan, as we all know them. They are fantastic. They were probably the most interesting studies of the female figure in Iranian photography, I think.